Now, before we speak of anxiety, before we speak of fear, before we speak of any condition of mind or body, let us come to rest for a moment. Not rest as the world understands rest, not the rest of exhaustion or collapse, but rest as withdrawal from effort. Rest as the laying down of personal responsibility for the government of life. For prayer does not begin with words, and it does not begin with asking. Prayer begins when the soul ceases its argument with life and becomes still enough to listen. Be still and know that I am God. That is not poetry. That is instruction. It is not a command to the body, nor a discipline of the mind. It is an invitation to return to reality. And so, in this moment, we are not trying to achieve stillness. We are allowing stillness to assert itself. Stillness is already present. It is the noise that is foreign. It is the tension that is unnatural. Peace is the native condition of being. We are not here tonight or this morning or this hour to analyze anxiety, to name it, to trace its causes, or to give it importance. Anxiety thrives on attention. It feeds on explanation. It multiplies when we make it an object of concern. And so we begin, as all true prayer begins, by lifting consciousness above the appearance and entering the awareness of that which is eternally so. The Master never began with the problem. He never began with the disease, the sin, the lack, or the fear. He began with God, always with God. I and my Father are one. The kingdom of God is within you. Take no thought for your life. These were not moral teachings. They were revelations of a state of consciousness in which the false claims of the world lose their voice. And so we begin where he began, not with what troubles us, but with what is. There is a temptation when we come together for prayer to come with urgency, to come with a need, to come with the hope that something will be done for us. But the infinite way is not a way of getting God to act. It is the way of recognizing that God is already acting, already present, already fulfilling itself as our very being. Prayer, then, is not an effort to reach God. Prayer is the yielding of the belief that we ever were separate from God. Closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, that is not metaphor. That is fact. God is not somewhere else. God is not waiting to be contacted. God is not responding to prayer. God is the substance of consciousness itself. And when we become still enough, quiet enough, humble enough to stop directing life, we find that we have never been outside the presence we were seeking. Let us understand this clearly. Anxiety does not disappear because we calm the mind. The mind calms because anxiety has lost its foundation. And anxiety has no foundation where God is acknowledged as the only presence, the only power, the only life. Fear requires a second power. Fear requires something other than God to exist. And in the moment we are willing to rest, even briefly, in the awareness of one infinite presence, fear has nothing to stand on. The psalmist tells us, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." Notice it does not say he who visits. It does not say he who prays occasionally. It says he who dwells. To dwell is to live, to abide, to remain. And the secret place is not a location. It is a consciousness. It is the consciousness that has ceased looking outward for cause and has turned inward to recognize source. Now, this turning inward is not introspection. It is not self-analysis. It is not watching thoughts or controlling breath. It is simply the quiet acknowledgement that there is something here before thought, beneath thought, beyond thought, and that something is not disturbed, it is not anxious, it is not hurried, it is complete. My peace I give unto you, the Master said, not as the world giveth. The world gives peace when circumstances improve. The Christ gives peace when truth is recognized. The world's peace is fragile. The peace of God is indestructible. And it is this peace that we are touching, not by effort, not by will, but by consent. So let us consent just now to stop doing, to stop fixing, to stop anticipating, to stop rehearsing the future or reliving the past. Let us consent to the presence that is already aware of us, sustaining us, breathing us, living us. In Him we live and move and have our being. Not we will live, not we hope to live, we live now. This is not withdrawal from life. This is entrance into life. Anxiety is always a sign that we have stepped outside the present moment into a personal sense of responsibility. Peace returns the moment we step back into divine government. And divine government does not require our supervision. There is nothing you need to do in this moment to deserve peace. There is nothing you need to correct in yourself to be worthy of stillness. Grace is not a reward. It is a fact. My grace is sufficient for thee. Sufficient not someday, not when conditions change, but now. Sufficient for this breath. Sufficient for this moment. Sufficient for this life. And so we rest. We do not try to rest. We rest. We do not seek God. We acknowledge God. We do not wait for peace. We recognize peace. For peace is not an experience. It is the absence of resistance to what eternally is. Let the mind be quiet if it will. Let it wander if it must. We are not concerned with the behavior of thought. We are concerned only with truth. And truth does not need cooperation from the mind to be true. Truth simply is, God is. That is enough for now. Now, as we remain in this atmosphere of prayer, not leaving it, not stepping out of it, we may begin to see more clearly what lies beneath the surface of anxiety. Not by probing, not by analyzing, but by allowing understanding to unfold. For anxiety is never the real condition. It is always the symptom. And until the false burden that produces it is uncovered and relinquished, anxiety will continue to present itself under many disguises. At the root of anxiety, there is almost always one assumption, so universal that it is rarely questioned: the belief that life is personal, that responsibility rests upon the individual, that outcomes depend upon human foresight, effort, wisdom, or strength. This belief is so deeply ingrained that it feels natural. Yet it is this very belief that produces fear, strain, and unrest. When a person says, "I am anxious," what is usually meant is this: I believe it is up to me to manage tomorrow, up to me to prevent loss, up to me to hold things together, up to me to make the right decision, say the right words, foresee the right consequences. And the weight of that belief, often unrecognized, presses upon consciousness until the body responds with tension, the mind with racing thoughts, and the heart with unease. But let us be very clear. This burden was never given to man by God. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. Notice that the scripture does not say, manage thy burden wisely. It does not say, carry it bravely. It says, cast it. Why? Because it was never yours to carry. Anxiety is not a personal failure. It is the inevitable result of assuming a role that does not belong to us, the role of creator, controller, and sustainer of life. Jesus spoke plainly on this point when he said, "Which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature?" And again, "Take therefore no thought for the morrow." These are not moral commands designed to shame us into calmness. They are revelations of spiritual law. They tell us that personal thought, has no creative authority over life, and when we try to give it such authority, strain follows. Anxiety, then, is not caused by circumstances. Circumstances are merely the stage upon which a deeper belief is acting. Two individuals may face the same condition. One rests in peace, the other trembles in fear. The difference is never the situation. The difference is the sense of responsibility assumed in consciousness when we believe that there are many powers, economic powers, medical powers, emotional powers, political powers. We feel small, vulnerable, exposed. We brace ourselves. We watch carefully. We anticipate danger. And the mind, trying to protect us, begins to rehearse possibilities endlessly. But all of this activity rests on one unexamined premise, that there is something out there that can act independently of God and against us. The moment that premise is accepted, even unconsciously, peace departs. The prophet Isaiah gives us a key when he says, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee." Stayed, not occasionally visiting, not turning in emergencies, but stayed. Anxiety appears when the mind strays from the recognition of one governing presence and begins to calculate, plan, defend, and anticipate as though it were alone in the universe. But we are not alone. We have never been alone, and we have never been in charge. It is this false sense of personal authorship that produces anxiety. The belief that I must figure it out, I must make it happen, I must prevent disaster, I must ensure survival. And yet the Master said, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin." And then he asks the quiet, penetrating question, "Are ye not much better than they?" That question is not answered intellectually. It is answered when we see that life has always been living itself long before we learned to worry, long before we learned to plan, long before we learned to fear. Breath has been breathing. The heart has been beating. Supply has been appearing. Guidance has been unfolding. And none of this was accomplished by personal strain. Anxiety is the signal that we have stepped out of alignment with this divine order and have taken upon ourselves a burden that belongs to God. Not because we are sinful, not because we are weak, but because we have been taught by the world to believe in separation. And so anxiety is not something to overcome, it is something to understand. When it appears, it is saying to us, you have forgotten who is governing this life. It is calling us not to effort, but to remembrance. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. That is not a condemnation of human activity. It is a revelation of the futility of personal control. When life is lived as a personal project, anxiety is inevitable. When life is lived as divine expression, peace is natural. Now, this does not mean that decisions are not made or actions taken. It means that they are no longer driven by fear. They arise from stillness, from listening, from the quiet, knowing that intelligence greater than personal mind is present and active. And so we begin to see that the burden beneath anxiety is not the condition we fear, but the belief that we must carry life ourselves. When that belief begins to loosen even slightly, anxiety begins to lose its grip, not because circumstances change, but because the false center of responsibility dissolves. We are not here to become better managers of anxiety. We are here to be free of the belief that produces it. And this brings us naturally, gently, into the next unfoldment of truth. As we move deeper into this unfoldment, remaining always within the atmosphere of prayer, it is necessary to touch a point that often brings confusion to sincere students on the spiritual path. Many come with honest hearts, having tried faithfully to overcome anxiety through every available means, through discipline, through positive thinking, through affirmations, through breathing exercises, through mental control, and yet they find that anxiety returns, and sometimes when it returns with greater force, bringing discouragement and the belief that they have failed spiritually. But there has been no failure. What has failed is the belief that anxiety can be conquered by method. The human mind is endlessly inventive. It loves technique. It loves systems. It loves steps and formulas. And so it naturally assumes that peace must also be attained by some form of mental or emotional practice. Yet peace is not an achievement. Peace is a state of being. And no method can bring us into a state that already exists. Only realization can do that. Jesus never gave a method for peace. He never instructed anyone to repeat words, regulate breath, or discipline thought patterns. He said, simply, peace, be still. And those words were not addressed to the storm. They were spoken from a consciousness that knew only one power. The stillness was not produced, it was revealed. Methods fail because they operate within the very assumption that produces anxiety, the belief that I must do something to fix my condition. And every time we try to manage anxiety through personal effort, we reinforce the sense of a separate self struggling against a problem. That struggle itself becomes the fuel of unrest. Let us be very clear here. There is nothing wrong with quieting the mind or calming the body. These may offer temporary relief, but temporary relief is not freedom. And when the underlying belief remains untouched, the belief in a personal self responsible for life anxiety will simply return in another form. Realization succeeds where methods fail because realization does not attempt to change appearances. It corrects consciousness. It does not work on anxiety. It removes the belief that gives anxiety its seeming authority. It does not fight fear. It withdraws consent from the premise that fear has power. This is why the Master said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." He did not say, practice the truth. He did not say, affirm the truth. He said, know the truth. And knowing in the spiritual sense is not intellectual agreement. It is recognition. It is awakening. It is the sudden or gradual realization that something assumed to be real never was. Anxiety is not healed by effort. It is dissolved by understanding. When light enters a room, darkness does not struggle. Darkness does not resist. Darkness does not gradually improve. Darkness disappears, not because it was defeated, but because it was never something in itself. It was only the absence of light, And so it is with anxiety. It is not an entity. It is not a condition. It is the absence of realized truth. Now, this is where many students become impatient. They say, but I know these things. I believe in God. I believe God is all. And yet anxiety persists. Why? Because belief is not realization. Belief is often theoretical. Realization is experiential. Belief says, I accept this idea. Realization says, this is what is. And realization cannot be forced. You cannot make yourself realize truth. You cannot hurry realization. You cannot command consciousness to awaken. What you can do, and all that is ever required, is to stop resisting truth, to stop arguing with it, to stop substituting effort for surrender. Methods give the mind something to do. Realization asks the mind to become quiet. This is why the infinite way places such emphasis on silence. Not silence as a discipline, but silence as receptivity. Silence is the doorway through which realization enters. In silence, the mind ceases its activity long enough for truth to register not as thought, but as awareness. And here is the great paradox. The more desperately we want peace, the further we seem from it. The more we strive for stillness, the more restless we become. But the moment we relinquish the struggle, truly relinquish it, peace asserts itself without effort. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. If our spiritual practice feels heavy, strained, or exhausting, something is wrong, not with us, but with the approach. Truth never burdens. Truth liberates. The reason realization succeeds is because it restores us to what has always been so. It does not add anything to us. It removes the false sense of separation. It reveals that we were never meant to live as isolated selves managing a hostile world. We were meant to live as the expression of divine life, upheld, governed, and sustained by the very presence that brought us into being. And so, instead of asking, what method should I use to calm my anxiety, we begin to ask a very different question. What belief am I entertaining that is not true? And the answer, sooner or later, always comes back to the same point, the belief in a power apart from God and a responsibility resting upon a personal self. When that belief is gently, patiently released, not resisted, not condemned, but released, anxiety has nothing left to stand on. And this brings us naturally to the next unfoldment, where we touch the heart of this teaching. And now we come to a point so simple that the human mind is often tempted to pass it by. It seems too brief, too unadorned, too insufficient for the complexity of our problems. And yet, it is precisely this simplicity that carries the power of release. For truth does not need embellishment. Truth does not need explanation. Truth only needs to be recognized. The simplest truth ever spoken is this: God is, not God will be, not God can be, not God may intervene. Simply God is. And in that statement, rightly understood, every fear dissolves, every burden is lifted, every argument ends. Before Abraham was, I am, not I was, not I shall be. I am, the eternal present, the timeless now. Anxiety cannot live in the now, because anxiety is always about something else, something later, something past, something imagined. God is brings consciousness back to the only place where truth operates, the present, moment. When Moses asked, "Who shall I say sent me?" the answer was not a name, not a description, not a function. The answer was, "I am that I am." That was not theology. That was revelation. It was the unveiling of being itself, self-existent, self-sustaining, needing nothing, lacking nothing, opposing nothing. And yet, how often do we live as though God is not present in this decision, not active in this body, not governing this circumstance? How often do we postpone God to the future, hoping that someday, somehow, he will arrive and correct what troubles us now? But God does not arrive. God is never absent. God does not enter situations. God constitutes reality. This is where the mind must be very still, because it wants to take this truth and use it. It wants to say, if God is, then he should fix this. But the moment we try to use God, we have already stepped away from the truth. God is not a power to be directed. God is the only power there is, and where that is recognized, there is nothing left for God to fix, because there is nothing opposing him. Jesus did not say, God will overcome your fear. He said, be not afraid. Why? Because fear has no foundation in a universe where God is all. Fear exists only where God is believed to be absent, divided, or limited. God is not a statement to repeat. It is a realization to rest in. When truly acknowledged, it leaves no room for a second presence, a second cause, a second law. And anxiety, at its root, is always the fear of a second cause, the fear that something other than God may act, decide, determine, or destroy. But if God is, then what is not God has no law, no continuity, no intelligence, no life. This is why the Master never asked God to destroy evil. He never prayed for God to remove disease. He never begged for protection from circumstances. He simply stood in the conscious awareness of God's allness. And in that awareness, the appearances that troubled others had no authority. Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. That was not defiance. That was understanding. Jesus was not saying that Pilate had power. He was saying that all power belongs to God, and therefore Pilate had none of his own. When we say God is, and allow that truth to sink beneath words, beneath thought, beneath emotion, something very subtle happens. The mind stops scanning for danger. The body loosens its grip. The heart ceases its vigilance. Not because we have convinced ourselves that everything will be fine, but because we have stepped out of the belief that we must ensure that it will be. God is requires no future. It requires no improvement. It requires no explanation. It stands complete. And notice this: when anxiety appears, it is always saying something is missing. Something must be added, more information, more control, more preparation, more effort. But God declares that nothing is missing. Nothing has fallen outside divine presence. Nothing has escaped divine government. This is why the words are enough. Not as a phrase, but as a doorway. We are not trying to feel God. Feeling comes and goes. We are not trying to see God. Sight is unreliable. We are simply acknowledging what has always been true. And truth does not require our agreement to remain true, but our peace does. So we rest here, not asking anything, not seeking anything, not trying to apply anything. We let the truth announce itself within us, gently, quietly, without effort. God is. And because God is, we need add nothing. When we begin, even faintly, to rest in the realization that God is, we discover something that may at first seem surprising. The mind grows quiet not because it has been disciplined, but because it has nothing left to argue about. Anxiety, after all, is an argument. It is a conversation carried on within oneself, a debate between hope and fear, between what might go wrong and what might go right. And this argument can continue endlessly so long as there appears to be something undecided, something unresolved, something yet to be determined. But God is ends the debate. An argument requires two sides. Anxiety requires two powers. It needs a force that threatens and a self that must defend. It needs a future that is uncertain and a present that feels insufficient. But when consciousness rests even momentarily in the awareness of God's allness, the structure that supports the argument collapses. There is nothing left to negotiate with. God does not answer anxiety's questions. It dissolves the need to ask them. The human mind wants explanations. It wants reassurance. It wants guarantees. And anxiety speaks in the language of what if. What if this happens? What if I fail? What if I lose? What if my body betrays me? What if tomorrow brings something I cannot handle? These questions feel urgent, but they are all rooted in time. They all presume a future in which God may or may not be present. But God is never in the future. God is never in the past. Jesus said, "Take therefore no thought for the morrow." Not because the future will necessarily be easy, but because the future does not exist as a place where truth can operate. Truth is always now. Grace is always now. Supply is always now. And when consciousness returns to the now, anxiety has no language with which to speak. Notice this carefully. Anxiety cannot exist without projection. It cannot remain active without dragging thought forward or backward. It has no power in the present moment. And God anchors awareness firmly, gently in the present, not as a mental exercise, but as a spiritual fact. When we say inwardly and without effort, God is, we are not making a declaration to overcome fear. We are simply standing still long enough for reality to assert itself. And reality is not anxious. Reality is complete. The inner argument always begins when we assume that something must be added to this moment for it to be safe, acceptable, or whole. But the moment we recognize that God is fully present here, governing, sustaining, fulfilling, there is nothing left to add. And where there is nothing to add, there is nothing to fear losing. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Not I shall not want someday. Not I shall not want if conditions improve. I shall not want now. Want ends when God is recognized as present, because want is always the sense of absence. Anxiety argues for vigilance. It says, stay alert, stay tense, stay ready. But this vigilance is based on the belief that danger is real and God is distant. When that belief is withdrawn, vigilance gives way to watchfulness, not anxious watchfulness, but spiritual awareness. The awareness that knows quietly and without effort. That divine intelligence is already at work. God is also ends the argument of self-blame. Anxiety often turns inward, accusing the individual of not doing enough, not being enough, not foreseeing enough. But if God is the source and substance of life, then life is not a personal achievement. It is a divine expression, and no expression can fall outside its source. Here, we begin to see why the master could sleep in a boat during a storm. It was not because he was indifferent to danger. It was because there was no inner argument taking place within him. There was no question in his consciousness as to who governed that moment. The storm did not require his supervision. So it is with us. The moment the inner debate ceases, even briefly, the body responds. The breath deepens. The muscles soften. The heart slows. Not because we have done something to the body, but because the false signal of danger has been withdrawn. The body is an obedient servant of consciousness. This is why we do not need to silence thoughts aggressively. We do not need to push anxiety away. We do not need to replace fearful thoughts with positive ones. The argument ends on its own when its premise is removed, and the premise is always the same: the belief that God is not fully present here and now. When that belief yields even slightly, the mind has nothing left to manage. It rests, and in that resting, peace is not produced, it is revealed. God is not a conclusion. It is a beginning without effort, a beginning without fear, a beginning that has no end. And as this realization deepens, we are led naturally into the next unfoldment, where we see more clearly how fear has been sustained and how gently its support can be withdrawn. Now we come to a point of great importance, one that, when understood, even in a small degree, begins to loosen anxiety at its root. It is the recognition that anxiety has been treated as a power when in truth it has none. And this error, so common, so subtle, is rarely questioned even among sincere students of truth. We speak of anxiety as though it were something that acts upon us. We say it comes and goes. We say it grips us, overwhelms us, paralyzes us. We arrange our lives around it. We anticipate it. We prepare for it. And in doing so, without realizing it, we confer upon it a reality and an authority it does not possess. But anxiety is not a power. It is not a cause. It is not an entity. It is not an intelligence. It is a claim, a suggestion resting entirely upon belief. Here we must be very still and very honest, because the mind will resist this truth. It will say, but I feel it. And yes, the feeling may be intense, but intensity is not proof of reality. A dream may feel vivid, terrifying, convincing until we awaken, and then we discover that nothing in the dream had power over us except our belief while we were dreaming. So it is with anxiety. It exists only so long as it is believed in. It operates only so long as it is consented to. It continues only so long as it is treated as something to be managed, feared, or resisted. Jesus never treated fear, disease, sin, or lack as powers. He did not argue with them. He did not analyze them. He did not fear them. He simply ignored their claim to authority. Why reason ye in your hearts? He asked. Why indeed? Why grant reality to what has no divine source? In the infinite way, we learn that there are not two powers in this universe. There is not the power of God and the power of fear. There is not the power of spirit and the power of anxiety. There is one power, and that power is God. And if that is true, and it is, then anxiety has no power of its own. It can only appear to have power when we lend it our belief. This is why fighting anxiety never works. When we fight something, we acknowledge it as an opponent. When we resist something, we concede that it has force. But anxiety cannot be overcome by resistance any more than darkness can be overcome by pushing against it. Darkness disappears only when light is present. So we do not say, I must get rid of this anxiety. That is still granting it power. We say, instead, quietly, inwardly, this has no divine authority. And we do not say it to make something happen. We say it because it is true. God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. If fear were a power, God would have had to create it or permit it, but Scripture denies this. Fear is not from God. Therefore, it has no law, no support, no continuity. Now the mind may object again and say, but anxiety seems very real to me. And we answer gently, so did leprosy to those who brought it to Jesus. So did blindness. So did death. But appearances have never been the measure of truth. The measure of truth is origin. And what does not originate in God has no true existence, no matter how convincing it appears. Here is where we must be careful not to fall into denial. We are not saying that anxiety does not appear. We are saying that its appearance does not constitute reality. We are not pretending it is not felt. We are recognizing that feeling is not authority. When we stop treating anxiety as a power, something very subtle happens. We no longer brace against it. We no longer watch for it. We no longer identify ourselves with it. We no longer say, this is happening to me. We say, instead, often without words, this is not of God, and therefore it has no law to sustain it. And we leave it there. No struggle, no effort, no battle. Anxiety fades, not because it is pushed away, but because it is no longer fed. It is fed by attention. It is fed by fear. It is fed by belief. Withdraw belief, and anxiety has nothing left to live on. This withdrawal is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is almost unnoticed, and that is why it is effective. The most powerful spiritual acts are always the least visible. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Resistance here does not mean struggle. It means refusal to grant reality. It means declining to accept the premise. It means standing so firmly in the awareness of one power that there is nothing left for fear to attach itself to. So when anxiety presents itself, and it may, for a time, we do not condemn ourselves. We do not ask why it is there. We do not try to fix it. We simply recognize that we have momentarily accepted a belief in a power apart from God, and we gently, quietly withdraw that acceptance. That is all. And this gentle withdrawal leads us naturally into the next unfoldment, the art of releasing power without resistance, without strain, without conflict. Now we come to a point where many earnest students make a subtle mistake, and that is why we must approach this gently. Having seen that anxiety is not a power, the mind is tempted to do something about it, to deny it forcefully, to reject it aggressively, to declare it unreal with intensity. But this, too, is a form of resistance. And resistance, however well-intentioned, still implies that there is something there to resist. In the infinite way, we learn that truth does not operate through struggle. Truth does not fight error. Truth simply reveals itself, and error disappears because it never had substance. Therefore, withdrawing power from anxiety is not an act of will. It is an act of understanding. We do not push anxiety away. We do not argue with it. We do not command it to leave. All of these still grant it presence. Instead, we quietly cease to feed it. We stop supplying it with belief, attention, fear, and anticipation. And this cessation is not dramatic. It is almost unnoticed. When anxiety arises, the natural human impulse is to tighten the mind, tighten the body, tighten control. But tightening is a form of agreement. It says something dangerous is happening. And so, rather than tightening, we learn to soften, not to relax the body deliberately, but to relax the belief that something is required of us in this moment. Jesus said, "Why take ye thought?" He did not say, "Stop thinking." He asked, "Why?" Why grant thought authority over what God is already governing? That simple question dissolves resistance. It does not fight fear. It exposes its futility. Withdrawing power then looks like this. Anxiety presents itself, and instead of responding, we become still. Not frozen, not withdrawn, but inwardly still. We do not follow the thought. We do not finish the sentence. Anxiety begins. We do not imagine the outcome it suggests. We simply do not go there. And in that non-movement, truth asserts itself. This is what the psalmist meant when he wrote, "Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." Salvation is not something that happens because we act. It is something that becomes visible when we stop acting from fear. Standing still is not passivity, it is alignment. Now, the mind may protest. If I don't think about this, something will go wrong. That protest reveals the belief that fear is protective, but fear has never protected anyone. It has only exhausted, confused, and misled. Divine intelligence does not require fear as its assistant. When we withdraw power without resistance, we are saying without words, God is sufficient here. And that acknowledgement is enough. Not repeated, not emphasized, not dramatized, simply acknowledged. There is a deep humility in this practice. It is the humility of relinquishing the role of manager of the universe. It is the humility of admitting that life does not need our anxiety to function correctly. And humility is not weakness. It is spiritual strength. God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. The proud are those who believe they must carry life themselves. The humble are those who know that life is already carried. You may notice that when you stop resisting anxiety, it does not always disappear instantly. Sometimes it lingers, like an echo. But an echo has no source of its own. It fades because nothing is sustaining it. So do not be concerned with how long it remains. Time is irrelevant. What matters is that you are no longer granting it authority. Withdrawing power is not an event. It is a posture of consciousness. And the more familiar this posture becomes, the less frequently anxiety appears. Not because you have mastered a technique, but because the false premise upon which anxiety rests is no longer being entertained. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. Anxiety cannot be dissolved by might, by effort, by determination. It yields only to spirit, to the quiet recognition of God's allness. And spirit operates without noise, without strain, without conflict. So we learn to let anxiety pass through consciousness without resistance, without interest, without fear. We let it come and go as clouds pass through the sky, knowing that the sky itself is untouched. And as this becomes clearer, we are ready to move into a deeper understanding, one that shows us how God is not a phrase, not a concept, but a living awareness that gently holds consciousness in peace. Now, it is necessary that we pause here, because there is a subtle danger at this point on the path. Having heard the words, God is, the human mind is quick to turn them into a phrase to be repeated, a formula to be used, a statement to be applied. But the moment God is becomes a mantra, it loses its power, not because the words are wrong, but because truth cannot be reduced to repetition. God is not something to say in order to make something happen. It is something to realize, and realization is never mechanical. If repeating words could bring peace, then peace would be a mental product. But peace is not mental. Peace is spiritual. It is the natural state of consciousness when it is no longer divided against itself. And division ceases not through repetition, but through recognition. The Master never repeated affirmations. He never taught others to repeat them. He lived from a state of awareness so clear, so undivided, that his words carried authority. When he said, "Peace, be still," it was not because the words themselves were powerful, but because the consciousness behind them knew no second power. So when we speak of God is, we are not giving ourselves something to hold on to. We are letting go of everything that is not true. We are not filling the mind, we are emptying it. We are not concentrating. We are relaxing attention into reality. A mantra keeps the mind busy. Awareness allows the mind to rest. When God is becomes living awareness, it is no longer something you say, it is something you notice. It is the quiet recognition that being is present, that life is here, that intelligence is functioning without your assistance. It is the recognition that you are not trying to contact God because you have never been separate from God. The kingdom of God is within you, not within your thoughts, not within your emotions, but within consciousness itself. And consciousness does not need to be forced into awareness. It already is awareness. This is why silence is so important. Not silence as discipline, but silence as permission. When you stop repeating words, when you stop directing thought, when you stop monitoring results, awareness naturally deepens. And in that deepening, the truth of God is reveals itself without effort. At first, this awareness may feel very subtle. There may be no sensation, no emotion, no reassurance. And that is good. We are not seeking experiences. We are resting in truth. Truth does not always announce itself to the senses. Often it simply is quietly, steadily, without display. The mind may say, nothing is happening, but the mind has never been the judge of spiritual activity. The wind bloweth where it listeth. Thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. Spirit does not move according to human expectation. Living awareness of God is like opening a window. You do not pull the air in, you do not push the air out, you simply remove the obstruction, and the atmosphere changes on its own. So we do not watch ourselves to see if we are doing this correctly. We do not ask, am I aware enough? Am I peaceful enough? Those questions return us to effort. Instead, we simply notice that we are no longer arguing, no longer bracing, no longer anticipating, and that noticing is enough. When God is lived rather than spoken, fear loses its reference point. Fear always asks, what if God is not present here? Awareness answers not verbally, not mentally, but with stillness. And stillness is the answer fear cannot survive. You may find, as this awareness deepens, that thoughts still come. Let them come. Awareness is not disturbed by thought. It is only disturbed by identification with thought. When thoughts pass through consciousness without being claimed, they lose their urgency. This is why we do not try to stop thinking. We simply stop believing everything we think. We stop granting thought the authority to define reality. Reality is defined by God, not by mental activity. And here is a gentle assurance. You cannot fail at this. Awareness is not something you produce. It is what you already are beneath the noise. Every moment you stop trying, even for an instant, you are already there. So God is not a tool you pick up in moments of distress. It is the ground you learn to stand on always. And standing on that ground, you begin to notice something else, something very practical and very gentle, how the body itself responds to truth. And this leads us naturally into the next unfoldment. Now we touch a point that brings great comfort to many because it explains something that has often been misunderstood. When anxiety eases, when the breath deepens, when the body relaxes, it is not because we have done something to the body. It is because the body has responded to a change in consciousness. The body is not the cause, it is the instrument. It is not the originator, it is the reflector. The body does not decide to be anxious. It does not generate fear. It obeys the signals it receives from thought and belief. And when belief is rooted in separation, when consciousness accepts the premise that it is alone, vulnerable, and responsible, the body faithfully responds with tension, alertness, and defense. This is not failure. It is obedience. But when consciousness rests in truth, the body responds just as faithfully. Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost? A temple does not create the presence. It bears witness to it. When consciousness recognizes God as present, as governing, as sufficient, the body registers that recognition without instruction. Muscles soften. Breathing becomes natural. The heart steadies itself. The nervous system, no longer receiving messages of threat, returns to equilibrium. This is why we do not need to work on the body. We do not need to persuade it to relax. We do not need to monitor symptoms. The body is intelligent in its own way, but it takes its cues from consciousness. And consciousness, when aligned with truth, gives the body the only message it needs. All is well because God is. Many have said, I tried to calm myself, but my body wouldn't respond. And that is because calmness cannot be imposed from the outside. It must arise from understanding. The body resists forced relaxation just as it resists forced control. But it never resists truth. When the Master said to the man with the withered hand, stretch forth thy hand, he was not commanding muscles. He was speaking to consciousness. And consciousness, recognizing no obstruction, allowed the body to respond. The healing was not in the command. It was in the absence of belief and limitation. So it is with anxiety. when we stop sending the body messages of danger, messages rooted in fear of the future, fear of loss, fear of failure, the body does not need to remain tense. It lets go naturally because tension has no purpose where there is no threat. This is why we must not become concerned with physical sensations during prayer or meditation. Sensations come and go. Some feel warmth, some feel heaviness, some feel nothing at all. None of these are measures of spiritual progress. The true measure is this: has the belief in a power apart from God been weakened? If it has, the body will show it in its own time and in its own way. Do not watch the body. Do not check the breath. Do not wait for signs. These return attention to effect rather than cause. Simply remain in the quiet acknowledgement of presence. The body knows what to do when consciousness stops interfering. Fearfully and wonderfully made. That includes the nervous system. It was not designed to live in constant alarm. It was designed to respond to truth. And truth is not alarming. Truth is stable, continuous, unchanging. As this understanding deepens, many find that even when anxious sensations arise, they no longer provoke fear. The sensation may appear, but it no longer carries meaning. It is no longer interpreted as danger, and without interpretation, it loses its power. This is an important point. Anxiety is sustained not by sensation, but by meaning. Remove the meaning, remove the belief that something is wrong, and sensation passes harmlessly, like a ripple on water. So we do not say, I must get rid of this feeling. We say, inwardly and without words, this feeling has no authority over me. Not because we are strong, but because God is. And here we begin to see how naturally silence asserts itself not as emptiness, not as withdrawal, but as the natural habitat of truth. When consciousness no longer argues, no longer resists, no longer supervises, silence appears of its own accord. And it is into this silence that we now move. And now we find ourselves naturally entering silence, not as a technique, not as an exercise, but as the inevitable atmosphere of truth. Silence is not something we create. Silence appears when there is nothing left to say, nothing left to defend, nothing left to manage. Silence is the evidence that the inner argument has ended. Elijah heard a still, small voice. Not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in stillness. And so it is always. God does not shout over fear. God does not compete with noise. God is revealed when the noise subsides of its own weight. Silence is not emptiness. It is fullness without form. It is awareness resting in itself. And anxiety cannot live here because anxiety requires movement, prediction, anticipation. Silence has no future to fear and no past to regret. Silence is when consciousness rests in silence. It is not asleep. It is awake beyond thought. It is alert without strain. It is present without effort. This is the secret place of the Most High, not hidden by distance, but by stillness. Do not fear silence. Do not rush to fill it. Do not interpret it. Silence is doing the work that no thought ever could. Here we begin to see anxiety in a new light, not as an enemy, not as a failure, but as a signal, a call, a reminder that attention has drifted into personal sense, into time, into responsibility that does not belong to us. Whenever anxiety appears, it is saying only one thing: You have momentarily forgotten the nature of God. And forgetting is not sin. Forgetting is human. But remembrance is immediate. The prodigal son did not have to earn his way home. He only had to return. And returning was not a journey through space. It was a shift in consciousness. So when anxiety arises, we do not condemn ourselves. We do not say, I should know better. We simply return to presence, return to now, return to the quiet acknowledgement, God is. And that is enough. Anxiety is always forecasting. It is always projecting images into a future that does not exist. It says, what if this continues? What if it gets worse? What if I cannot handle what comes next? But grace does not operate in forecasts. Grace operates now. Give us this day our daily bread, not tomorrow's bread, not next year's provision, this day. And when this day is met with presence, the next day takes care of itself. When we live without forecasting, we do not become careless. We become receptive. We stop living ahead of grace. We stop demanding answers before they are needed, and life unfolds with a precision far greater than human planning. This realization is not reserved for quiet hours alone. It meets us in interruptions, in sudden symptoms, unexpected news, difficult conversations, sleepless nights. In those moments, we do not preach to ourselves. We do not recite truths. We simply pause inwardly and acknowledge God is here. Not spoken aloud, not explained, just known. That single inward pause is often enough to prevent anxiety from taking root. And even when it has already appeared, that pause loosens its grip. Surrender is often misunderstood. It is not giving up on life. It is giving up the false sense of authorship. It is not weakness. It is alignment. Collapse says, I cannot go on. Surrender says, God is going on. And where surrender occurs, strength appears. Not personal strength, but spiritual stamina. Life continues, but without strain. Here, gratitude arises not because something has improved, not because anxiety has disappeared, but because presence has been recognized. Give thanks in all things, not for all things, but in all things. Gratitude for God Himself, not for conditions. This gratitude is quiet. It does not celebrate outcomes. It rests in being. Now comes a gentle but essential moment, forgiveness of the self. Not because anxiety is wrong, but because self-judgment sustains separation. There is no spiritual failure in fear. There is only an opportunity for remembrance. Neither do I condemn thee. That voice must be heard inwardly. Condemnation tightens. Forgiveness releases. As consciousness deepens, the need for proof fades. We no longer ask, is this working? We no longer look for signs. Faith is not certainty about outcomes. Faith is resting without evidence. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Believed not intellectually, but existentially. Fear begins to run out of words. Its stories lose coherence. Its urgency fades. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer compel attention. They pass without consequence. Where there is no audience, anxiety has nothing to say. Now, this realization becomes a way of life, not a practice. We do not go into presence. We live from it. Daily activities unfold without commentary. Decisions arise without strain. Silence accompanies movement. Pray without ceasing means live without leaving awareness. And now there is nothing to conclude. No summary is needed. No instruction remains. We simply abide, not holding on to peace, not guarding stillness, just remaining where we have always been. God is, and because God is, all is well.